Now it's time for perspective, and it is 23 years today since the single most sudden and devastating news event that perhaps changed the planet in our lifetimes more than any other. Now I'm talking about 9/11, of course, the day 4 coordinated Islamist terrorist suicide attacks were carried out against the US, killing almost 3,000 people. Now, assuming you were old enough at the time, we all remember where we were and where we were when we heard that news, and we all remember as well the aftermath of that, the war on terror, notably in Afghanistan and Iraq. The ramifications then of all that still being felt today, 23 years on. Well, with me is Elie Baranets. He's a researcher in international security at the Institute for Strategic Research, IRSEM, which is a research institute of the French military armed forces. Thanks very much for joining us on the programme today. Let's go back, first of all, to the early 2000s. I mean, what were the main initial consequences, do you think, of 9/11?
Well, first, you got to remember that the US was almost sanctuarized for any attack on its soil. There was Pearl Harbor from the Second World War, but that was in Hawaii. And then the US grew in this period that they were very safe from exterior attack. And in 2000, they've been, the winner of the Cold War. And the current narrative was the fact that they were no history anymore. So they really did not expect anything to happen. So at that moment, when this happened, the first thing was surprise. How could you possibly understand what's going on? And then, of course, emotion, anger. So the event as such in itself has triggered this kind of feeling. But of course, what will matter the most on the long term will be how political actors, what they will make out of it.
I mean, it really changed in it the way the US saw the world and decided, if you like, that it had to go out into the world to try and eliminate this problem.
Yes. The thing is that George W. Bush has been elected on a rather isolationist program. And for him, at least, and there was an important Bush factor, for him, 9/11 was a turning point. So it definitely convinced him personally that he had to do something about it. And because of his personal journey also, it was something almost messianic. So, of course, that was the reason why he changed his perspective, him and the people around him. Now that a bunch of neoconservatives around him also, and some hawks that were already convinced that he should go harder. But he was not at that point. But the fact that he and his administration decided to launch military operations over the world and that they will last for decades, I would say is not the direct consequence of 9/11. 9/11 as such is just an event, and you give him the meaning that you want. So that was a political choice to give to this event this specific meaning. So that's how, in the coming weeks and months, has been developed in the US this narrative of global war on terror that we've been using for 2 decades now. And this is really this that has, I would say, framed US grand strategy for 2 decades. And this is within this framework that we can understand what the US has done, what has failed, more than 9/11 as such.
So what has worked and what has failed then, looking back on it?
So it's consensually perceived as a failure, basically. Now, I would like to say, and this might sound counterintuitive, that global war on terror as such is not a failure, because global war on terror is not a war. Global war on terror is the name that you give to that narrative surrounding this event and its aftermath. And if you judge a narrative not by its consequences, because it's not a political measure, but on what it's supposed to do, legitimize a position and try to trigger public support, it was a huge success. Maybe the US has been prisoner of its actually success. So Obama couldn't get out of it quite easily. We're just getting out of it right now. So global war on terror as such is a success in the sense that people will then more easily legitimize political actions. And it was also because the discourses at that time were very well conceived, consistently given and coherent. There may have been some other good points, the fact that now the US is definitely more ready to face terrorist attacks that are better and counterinsurgency. But the major failures are the political measures that were taken in the name of global war on terror. So, of course, You go into Afghanistan first. It works pretty well. After a few months, you take out the regime. Al-Qaeda is not there anymore. And then you go back to Iraq. It looks pretty well in the first month also. Saddam Hussein is overthrown. But then you have chaos.
The longer term is much more
Yes,
complicated.
of course, that's the longer term the problem. You have chaos, you have Al-Qaeda that comes back also, that spread into Syria, you have ISIS, you have Taliban that go back to Afghanistan, that fuels anti-Americanism everywhere. And this is not only, I would say, incidental coincidence, consequence of it. This is actually the logical consequence of the way the global war on terror has been framed in a Manichaean way, in which you wouldn't take into account the specificities of the theaters in which you were going to be involved. So, of course, this may be a broader American problem to try to minimize the social peculiarities of the theaters that get involved in. But in this case, with the neoconservatives that were Manichaean and that were very much influencing that decision-making process. That was the logical consequence of it.
I wanted to pick up on a phrase that you used earlier on, we're just getting out of it now. I mean, 23 years on, I mean, It's incredible, isn't it, that it has lasted that long. And why do you say we're getting out of it now? Is it just because of some of those things you just said? To a certain extent, the situation in Iraq and Afghanistan has almost gone back to what it was before.
I believe it's mostly because that narrative makes sense. It makes sense. So September 11 didn't make sense first, based on the previous narratives. Basically, we won the Cold War at the end of history. How come this happened to us? We're strong. The world is on the verge of liberalization. But with that narrative of global war on terror, there's evil. We need to fight it. You are with us or against us. The world now makes sense. And when it makes sense for many people who are deeply hurt, this is the way they perceive the world of the US. And then if you want to move from this, you need another narrative that makes more sense. And that was almost impossible. In order for the previous narrative to be surpassed, you needed an exogenous event like September 11 to make obviously realize to people that this did not make sense. So actually 2 decades is quite logical. It's a big problem if you believe that China, the rise of China is a problem rather than terrorism. But if people think through this, not only people, not only I would say the citizens, also the bureaucracy and political leaders, because we all use these narratives in order to think, then that would be the problem.
Just time to ask you, I mean, what about other countries within this as well? I mean, all sorts of other countries became very much affected, France included as well.
Yes. So, of course, we didn't have the same problem before. So, of course, we were also surprised, shocked. But we didn't have to go through this narrative. And we were not the target audience. The global war on terror, even though we talk about it globally, the audience was the US public. So France and other countries were more or less critical, or when they were embracing the expression global war on terror, then didn't mean it with the whole narrative that went with it. And actually, France was quite critical of it, even though that for some operations, they were allied to the United States. But they finally embraced it in 2015 also. So when countries are hurt by terrorism, there's a temptation also to go through this existing narrative that obviously is shaping things. And it also has consequences for people because when the US does something, it affects everybody around the world. So our military operation in France were affected also, somehow in a better way for us because we could count on the US help. They use a satellite, which was crucial for France in Mali, for example. That's how you can, that's when the US does something, everybody is affected somehow.
Good to have you with us on the programme today. Thanks very much for coming in and talking to us. Elie Baranets, a researcher in international security at the Institute for Strategic Research in Paris. Thanks very much.